Thornberry, West Wing.
Mrs. Murphy, when were you born?
I was about 103 years ago, you'll figure it out.
Do you remember Emmeline Gurney?
I remember hearing about her.
What did you hear?
Well, she was a mystery. She was a mystery. Nobody understood her. Well, I was only just like you. I was a witness.
Every small town in Maine has its legends, some of them true. Some are of heroes and heroines and can be told with pride, while others, like the tale of Emmeline, are stories of people deemed unworthy of official history, but who are remembered years later by people in the town because of sins and sufferings so dreadful that they become warnings for future generations. But time changes everything, even a town's notions of who is a sinner and who is sinned against.
They used to tell it as a bad example, don't be Emmeline, don't ever do what she did. Mind your own business, stay at home. The whole bit about woman not doing anything but what Papa tells her to. Then, of course, now with the change in attitude towards her problems, they seem to feel sorry for her more than anything else.
The story of Emmeline is shocking. But a shocking story can give insight into the taboos and punishments of the past, and into the daily lives of some of those people whose existence would never make it into the annals of history, were it not for scandals such as this one. Which is why we owe a debt to one small-town storyteller and reporter. It hurt her to reveal dark secrets about the town she loved, but for her, the story of Emmeline was a means of correcting old wrongs.
I am Nettie Mitchell. I am 89 years of age. I live in the town of Fayette, where I was born and have lived practically all my lifetime. And I would like to tell you one of the saddest and most heartbreaking tales that has come to my notice. It's a true story. Something that happened right here in this town in the long ago. I knew this old lady when I was a tiny child, and she was very sweet and lovely. She was one of a large family of children in a very impoverished home in the early 1800s. At the age of 13, visitors from Lynn, Massachusetts, arrived at their home, and seeing the poverty and deprivation there, said, why don't you let us take Emmeline back with us to Lynn, and she can work in the cotton mills. She's old enough to work there. And she can go work in the cotton mills and send you money to help with the expenses back home. They thought it over and decided to let her go, and she went. She was an efficient, hard-working little girl, but she was entirely among strangers in a strange land, very, very different than anything she had ever known before. Among those who were friendly to her, as most of them were not because she was entirely different, was her young boss, a young man. And he became very friendly, and she yielded to him, to his persuasion. And by the time she was 14, she was the mother of his child. She did not dare to let her people back home know what had occurred. The people where she was staying made arrangements to sell her baby to a childless couple nearby them who would pay her expenses and pay for her transportation back home if she would go as soon as she was able. She returned to her home, and she worked very hard in the fields and all, but she didn't join very freely in the social life of the community. As she grew older, her parents and others began to wonder why it was that she shunned all the young gentlemen around. She was a very pretty girl, and they couldn't understand it. In her early 30s, while she was working at home, a young man came to town to build highways. And he was a very personable young chap, and he came to board at their home. Although she was so many years older than he fell desperately in love with her, and she with him. And they decided to marry and have a home of their own. They did, and built a little cottage down by the shore of Mosher Pond. They moved in there and had been married something less than a year when his people from Massachusetts decided to come to visit them. They came down, and to their horror, they discovered that he had married his own mother. Of course, when this was revealed, the marriage was annulled, declared broken up, and he reluctantly bade her goodbye. It was considered a horrible sin for her to have had the child, and she had married illegitimately, and therefore she was entirely ostracized.
To be shunned by family and friends in a 19th century New England village was almost the equivalent of life imprisonment without trial.
No one went to comfort her. No one helped to support her. The silence of all those years.
Nettie Mitchell helped to break that silence because she felt that the injustice that Emmeline experienced was something that people today should know about. She first told the story to outsiders when this footage was shot in 1975. Generations of Fayette townspeople at that time had grown up hearing strange things about Emmeline. Nevertheless, such moral transgressions as hers were not the type of thing one discussed freely with children or strangers. People's attitudes began to change only after a best-selling author from New York heard of the story and came to Fayette to find out more from Nettie Mitchell.
I'm getting along.
Yeah, well, we all.
I'm 89 years
Yeah.
old now.
That author was named Judith Rossner, and other than Nettie herself, she found few people who were willing to talk about a shameful incident in their ancestors' lives. Because of the difficulties she encountered researching the story, Rossner did what any novelist would have tried to do. She turned the legend into a popular piece of fiction.
Judith, we've been able to find out quite a bit of information about Emmeline and about life in this town during her day that people apparently, even a few years ago, weren't willing to talk about. What's changed since you were working on your novel?
Well, when I went around originally, I could find nobody who knew Emmeline or had anything to say about her. I gather that that has changed and that there are many people who are quite convinced that they remember one part of the story or another, or knew Emmeline or knew someone who knew her or whatever. And aside from the normal human urge to participate in an event, perhaps another reason is that the existence of the book, and then of course of a great deal of television stuff, conversation, and so on about incest that had never been talked about very much before then, has made it all somewhat less forbidden. It's okay now to know something about it.
Ostracized by the town during her own lifetime, Emmeline has now become Fayette's most famous citizen. Emmeline was a real person. We've located town records that reveal that much and a great deal more. Her parents were Aaron and Sophia Batchelder, and Emmeline was the fourth of their 5 children living on what is now known as the Chesterfield Ridge Road. But to really understand Emmeline's story, why she was sent away, why she was punished so severely, one has to first understand the world she lived in. This wilderness was first settled when soldiers in the Revolutionary War received pieces of it as payment for their efforts, and brought families north from Massachusetts and New Hampshire to homestead among the rocks and mosquitoes and frosts of the province of Maine. It was beautiful countryside, but to make a home here was more difficult than many had imagined. Not one drawing or image of any sort exists that can show us what Emmeline and her family actually looked like. The lives of struggling rural families were rarely documented, except in a few melodramatic illustrations. The only way to glimpse their world at all is to piece together threads of written and oral history, her hometown's collective memory and our imagination.
People were carving out futures for themselves. With every tree they felled, with every pasture they cleared, there was the expectancy that life would get better. But when they cleared the last tree, when they cleared the last pasture, and moved the last rock they felt inclined to move, things were about as rugged as they were when they started. But they lost some of the expectancy, some of the anticipation.
By the time Emmeline Batchelder was born on January 30th in the year 1816, many families in Maine felt that even God had turned against them.
1816 and froze to death was one of the very worst years for Maine, agriculturally speaking and economically. There was a frost every month that year, even in the summer. The seed that was put in the ground froze, and no crop resulted. It was just dreadful. They felt that it was the end of everything. If Emmeline's family were on the edge of poverty, the year 1816 would plunge them really deep into poverty.
I don't believe that Emmeline had anything when she was growing up. I think that she might have had cast-off clothes from other people, and her parents may have had just enough to feed her meagerly.
Emmeline's life as the child of very poor people must have been a hard life. I don't believe anybody knows how bad it probably was. I believe that Emmeline's family were hungry at times.
I know what it was to grow up without having too much. But I don't say that I went to bed hungry any time. We always had, you know, and not that we growed. It might not be out of a store, but we had potatoes and vegetables and stuff like that was got through the summer. So we had enough to eat. Might have been the same thing, but we had enough to eat.
People were pretty good about helping each other with the hard work, the difficult work.
If you were excluded from this cooperative effort, much more threatening the world would be for you.
If a family was poor and they couldn't get along and there was work somewhere, why, a child might only be 8 or 9 years old and have to go to work. And around here, they were farmed out.
The farming out of child labor was not uncommon in New England. Childhood was a luxury most pioneers could hardly afford. Emmeline's parents probably tried to avoid a trap all too common among the poorest families, the trap in which children, like livestock, could become a tradable commodity among desperate neighbors.
This was something that was done, and I know as a man that I knew that his mother was sold for a horse or something, but they just they didn't have any money, and they had to have a horse or a mule or something, and they just traded them off.
And the children were lonesome growing up. They did an awful lot of taking care of themselves and going without, but they had the religious background to face it all.
It was the Baptist church that gave them that background. If Emmeline was like most people, the commandments and beliefs of the church would have become her rules, her beliefs. Fayette settlers had made this the first major building in town, and from it emanated all values, all structure, all knowledge with which they understood the trials and tribulations of life. When a new young member was baptized in this local pond, that act represented their lifelong commitment to a path of righteousness.
One would make a covenant with brothers and sisters to walk the Christian life. On the other hand, the members of that church community would likewise enter into a covenant to help keep them from all evil.
I remember reading the journals of the Reverend Dr. Paul Coffin, an early missionary preacher. And the most outstanding notation is, "There is witchcraft aplenty in Fayette."
Milk that would curdle, things that would fly through the air, strange things that would happen in the community and were reported to the church officials. And authority was sought over those spiritual powers as instructed by Jesus.
Church records indicate that there were women in Fayette during Emmeline's childhood who were suspected of witchcraft by the deacons of the church. Everyone, even Emmeline, would have known what punishment those women faced.
If a person did something which the congregation felt was wrong, they were censored by the congregation. And they had to appear in the church, and they had to confess the sin or the mistake they had made to the congregation in order to be either forgiven or accepted or ostracized from the church and the community.
One lady in the old times here found it more convenient to seek a soothsayer on Sunday than go to church. She would go 10 miles for a soothsayer, but wouldn't go a mile to church. For such a thing, they would be removed from the fellowship.
If she were a bad woman, you wouldn't want your children to go anywhere near her. You wouldn't want to have anything to do with her. You know, she might contaminate the whole of society.
Ostracizing any bad elements in town was an isolated community's most effective means of policing itself. Emmeline would have been taught early that to run afoul of the congregation meant losing the benefits of the only society there was in Fayette. This public school and others like it were built to reinforce the authority of the church. Children were taught how to read in order that someday they could live by the teachings of the Bible. Some children must have wondered how to reconcile the realities of their own lives with what they read in their school books.
If I were as poor as those little children who came here begging yesterday, I should not take the least comfort in the world. My little daughter is mistaken, said her mother. Poor children are just as happy as rich ones, except when they are suffering from cold or hunger, and that very seldom happens in America. Our Father who lives in heaven takes care of them as well as of you.
Often surprised me that more help was not forthcoming from the church for a family such as Emmeline's that was so very poor.
There was no advocate for the poor. Nobody cared. It was the custom in the towns to gather up the poor people who could not support themselves every May and hold an auction.
Throughout the northeastern United States, small towns had a primitive system of caring for their poor. Indigent men, women, and children, and whole families were displayed in local meeting houses and taverns so that people who were looking for cheap help or a bit of extra income could make a bid on a pauper. The lowest bidder took that pauper home as a worker and was paid by the town to lodge the person for 1 year.
The prices were quite interesting. If a pauper were old, maybe bedridden, unable to do any work at all, and have to even have her meals carried to her, you know, or if the person was mentally ill and were sold complete with their cage, the town would have to pay more for their care and keeping. Auctioning them off, it sounds like a terribly humiliating experience. To be set up and sold is actually what it amounted to. And people, they just feared poverty terribly.
There are other stories about single men, widowers, men who had never married, who bid off a pauper for, shall we say, purposes other than cooking their meals. That could have happened to her, too. She may not have been any better off if she had stayed in Fayette as a pauper than she was going to Lowell to the mills.
To send Emmeline away to work was the right thing to do. There's absolutely no question about it. Because if she saved the family from being sold at pauper auction, much worse could have happened to Emmeline than happened to her at Lowell. And they were simply choosing the lesser of two evils.
Although Nettie Mitchell said that Emmeline went to Lynn, it was almost certainly Lowell, Massachusetts, where she would have been sent. The city of Lowell had been built to produce cloth. Unlike other mill towns, the men who owned the corporations there had planned from the beginning to employ almost exclusively young women. For years, wagons, known as slavers, traveled New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine to seek out the girls who would do their work. God-fearing New England parents must have thought long and hard before sending their daughters. But the attractions of Lowell outweighed the negatives for many, many families. Girls like Emmeline were sent on what amounted to an heroic 3-day journey, so that there would be one less mouth to feed at home, and so they could send money back to the family from a world away. "2,500 women between the ages of 13 and 35 were assembled along the banks of the Pawtucket Falls and put to work 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. The masterminds of Lowell had utopian visions for their new city. They imagined a boarding school environment in which girls would better themselves not only financially, but culturally. Preachers, authors, and politicians were brought in to enlighten the young women and fill up their few non-working moments with uplifting activities. The mill owners also understood that New Englanders of Puritan stock would never have sent their daughters anywhere, no matter how attractive the wages being offered, if even a question of ethical impropriety existed. Thus Lowell was designed as a temporary extension of the New England villages from whence the girls came. Rules and regulations were enforced of which a strict father would approve. Regulations against failing to go to church, missing curfews, drinking, seeing men. But the female factory operatives, as they were called, were not as docile as the planners of the great experiment had hoped. The dormitory environment provided the girls a perfect forum for late-night discussions on politics, society, economics, women's rights. Young women from the frontier were exposed to urban ideas and industrial time clocks for the first time, and during Emmeline's day rose up in some of the first labor strikes in America. And despite all of the efforts to control the minds and desires of their employees, close and constant supervision of the female operatives by male overseers undoubtedly led to predictable problems. It seems inevitable that there would be girls like Emmeline who fell through the cracks of the elaborate system. What happened to her was exactly what every well-meaning parent feared most.
I think it was more his fault, because he was old enough to know better. And she certainly wasn't.
I think it just happened. I wouldn't blame her, I wouldn't blame him. A young girl does not grow up on a farm in the early 1800s without being aware of sex. Yes, they were brought up being taught thou shalt not, but sometimes we tend to forget what we were taught when something more important presents itself.
Most young people who live in Maine and in rural countries, both now and much more then, were too trusting. They were very innocent in a great many ways. And I think that Emily was just too trusting. And perhaps she did have this child, but I think it was, had she been a child of the city or a busy environment, she probably wouldn't have fallen into such a situation.
Unfortunately, there is no way to prove for certain whether Emmeline actually had a child in Massachusetts. Once again, her experiences simply may not have been considered worth noting officially. Employment records for most of the mill girls were thrown out long ago. Single women without property were not usually listed in town directories, and it would have been in no one's interest to make a written record of an illegitimate birth. Despite the lack of evidence, the details of Emmeline's personal tragedy remain vivid in the minds of Fayette citizens.
She was desperate because she knew the attitude of her people back home, and the lady where she was staying said, write and tell your folks that you are sick and you're coming home as soon as you're able. A fairly wealthy person who lived near was childless, and they bought the baby. They paid her board bill and her transportation home for the price. To think that an innocent child like her could have suffered for all those years because of that one mistake.
By all accounts, Emmeline Batchelder told no one in her hometown what happened. And it was the holding of that secret, her failure to confess and repent, that the town seems to have resented more than anything else she did later.
Nettie talked to me some about the difficulty of communicating sexual fears, difficulties, problems in an era when even permissible sex was not discussed. I suppose that what's true is that everyone's guilty feelings were in some way reinforced by the secretiveness. And what she essentially said to me was that in the old days, if one had such a secret, it was perfectly understandable that she would not go to someone.
If a woman was going to have a child out of wedlock, she wouldn't be considered too much back them days.
But perhaps had she told it when she first came home, they might have ostracized her for a while and then gradually gotten over it. Where, as it was, she was treated well until she was old enough so she needed the friendship and the help, and this is when she didn't get it.
The years after Emmeline's return to Fayette, from the mid-1830s on, saw the beginnings of great change. More roads, more mills, more machinery to do some of the tasks that used to be done by hand. Rural Maine was being slowly but totally transformed. With the advance of civilization came the advance of domesticity. More and more a woman's place of toil was inside the home rather than outdoors next to her husband. As a single girl, just home from the mills, Emmeline should have gone immediately into some man's home, because it was considered every woman's ultimate destiny and responsibility to be of service to her own husband in matrimony.
A man at that time owned his wife. His wife was his chattel. You didn't know that? I thought you must have heard that many times. Yes, the wife was their chattel.
What does that mean exactly? What can a man do with his chattel?
Just about anything they wanted to. If they wanted to take him out and chain him up and beat him up, why, nobody interfered as a rule, unless the woman's parents heard about it maybe and got mad about it, her father. Other than that, nobody would pay any attention. That was his wife. He had a right to do with her what he wanted to.
If anyone had known that Emmeline gave birth in Lowell, she almost certainly would have been considered unfit for marriage. Perhaps, as people say, Emmeline blamed herself or feared that marriage might reveal her dark secret. So she waited until she was almost 28 before she got married, old enough to have been considered a spinster, as the many unmarried former mill girls were known. But this marriage to a neighbor named George Chamberlain was actually Emmeline's first of 2 marriages, although Nettie and others were unaware of this first one until we discovered it in some records that were thought to have been lost. Emmeline and George Chamberlain lived together for almost 20 years, sharing Emmeline's parents' home. It's impossible to find photographs of women like Emmeline. Photographers were only hired to make portraits of rich people, and artists of her day seem to have been more interested in romantic subjects than sad ones. It's harder still to know what their thoughts consisted of, except perhaps by interpreting the private notes that a few of them left behind.
There was one woman who wrote in her diary, perhaps this will give you an idea how they felt. She said, it was in April 1863, she said, a lovely morning, but dreadful. Old Pete has died. Rufus found him in his stall this morning. The next line says, the president died too. Kind of gives you an idea of which was most important in her life. She did go on to say that Mr. Seward had been wounded, and they were aware of the news. And then she said, sometimes I wonder why I've been put here. Am I just to bear children? If so, I've been successful 6 times and failed twice.
Emmeline had 2 children, one illegitimate in Lowell, the other named Gustavius Chamberlain in 1844. Her husband, George, stops appearing in records after 1850. apparently leaving Emmeline alone with their son.
Women didn't have any way to support themselves in those days if their husband died or simply dropped out. And let me tell you, dropping out was a common thing in those days. People, when life got too much for them or when they wanted to leave and go west or go somewhere else, they just dropped out, disappeared from sight. And nobody had any fingerprints in those days, and nobody was looking forward to getting Social Security, so there was nothing to keep them from dropping out.
Emmeline and Gustavius begin to show up now in the town pauper records. The overseers of the poor in Fayette gave Gustavius a pair of shoes. Emmeline got sick and needed attention, for which a neighbor requested payment from the town. Gustavius eventually moved out, got married, and like his father, disappeared. If it weren't for what happened in 1878, when Emmeline was already 62 years old, no one would remember her today. Their chance meeting was 1 in a million, as if lightning had struck twice in the same place. But it is possible that a man might be attracted to a woman old enough to be the mother he never knew. Or perhaps for her, he was a reminder of something she'd lost so many years earlier. Whatever their reasons or their relationship, Emmeline Batchelder Chamberlain married Leonard Gurney on April 16th, the day that ultimately made her a legend in the eyes of her hometown. Records show only that he came originally from Massachusetts and left town a few years after the marriage.
His people from Massachusetts decided to come to visit them. They came down, and to their horror, they discovered that he had married his own mother. Of course, when this was revealed, the marriage was annulled, declared broken up, and he reluctantly bade her goodbye and went back with his foster parents to Massachusetts, where he remained for the rest of his life.
It just wasn't right. Good lot of animals today, you don't mix them up that way. Get males and females from some other source, you just don't mix them up that way. That just never was considered right.
Just imagine having a bombshell like that dropped, and that was, it was a triple header. There was the baby, there was the lie, the cover-up, and there was the marriage.
People in town are still debating what Emmeline's sin really was.
She didn't knowingly do anything wrong, did she? She didn't know it was her son when she married him. If she had, that would have been terrible, but she didn't know it, the way I understand it. She didn't know who he was. So.
I think, Lucy, her parents would be to blame for having sent a young girl away into the world entirely unprepared to earn money to help support them.
Yeah, but if a girl of that age had had a child, the girl would have been blamed because she brought disgrace on her family.
Yeah.
Premarital sex, lying, incest, there was no doubt Emmeline had strayed from the Christian path. To protect their own reputation, her people disassociated themselves from her disgrace.
Although her home was almost in sight, almost across the highway, from that of her mother and her brothers and sisters, none of them ever went to her or spoke to her. And nobody spoke to her. No one went near her. And therefore she was entirely ostracized.
I think it's a horrible punishment to be cast out of the community for the reason that no one goes it alone in this world. It's so difficult to be alone, to be lonely, to be without friends. I think as human beings, we're not made to go it alone in life. We need the support, the companionship, the love of other people. And today we would say that this needs to be found within the community of the church, which unfortunately perhaps it was not found back in the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s.
This part of the legend that Nettie told, the treatment of Emmeline by family, neighbors, and the church, is the most troublesome for current residents to deal with.
If you love God and understand his forgiveness, you wouldn't ostracize anyone. You'd be forgiving.
But that's 100% turnaround from the way it was before, because it sounds like the religious people who were shunning her before.
I don't think that the religious people were shunning her. I think it was people that didn't have any of that background, that would be the gossiping kind of people. I know my grandmother would never have ostracized her. She would have forgiven her for everything.
And yet everyone agrees that people did ostracize Emmeline. The final lonely years of her life are the most vivid in Fayette's collective memory. Many people in town have relatives who were alive when she was. Old attitudes and jokes about that strange lady who lived all alone on Mosher Pond were passed on from parent to child.
Do you think that people were mean to Emmeline because she was poor?
Probably. Probably poor, probably stupid.
Emmeline's house was located on a little plot of cleared land jutting out into a bog. The building, when I saw it, was in pretty bad repair. Probably no more than 12 foot square and not very well made. Walls were boarded instead of plastering on the inside.
I believe my father said she had chickens that she had there, and probably a little, when she was able, she probably had a little garden because there was room enough for a kitchen garden.
Even with people who grew up hearing about Emmeline to help us reconstruct, we can still only try and imagine what her life was like.
And each night, when it come dark, she would hustle the chickens into the house with her and close the door. And we used to think that was kind of funny to take the chickens to bed with her. And my brother teased my sisters about Emily. You're just like Emily, talking to the chickens. And I suppose that other people did the same way. She was different than the rest. Now that I am older and I realize the vicinity she lived, that swamp in back of where she lived is full of muskrats and weasels and everything else. And if she hadn't taken the chickens in the house, they probably wouldn't have been there in the morning when she got up. So that wasn't really so strange as it seemed when I was a child.
Grandfather wouldn't let Mother go down there because she was afraid Emmeline would contaminate her. No decent woman would go, but a child was safe. So he sent her with food and to make sure Emmeline was all right.
My father was of a kindly nature, and he knew the story, and he pitied the poor soul. And he used to send me down with a piece of salt pork. She was a frail little old lady when I knew her. Snowy white hair, bent and tottering somewhat, but always glad to see someone. And she would tell about the birds and how they made their nests and all kinds of things that interest a child. I think she was one of the most kindly people I ever knew. Even as a tiny child, I sensed the tragedy in her sadly smiling manner.
They evidently didn't go for a few days. When they did, they found her dead. Probably was not eating the right foods and everything. She eventually got sick and died.
Nothing to be found in the house that was of any possible value for diet or anything else. There were a few drops of molasses clinging to the bottom of a jug and a few grains of cornmeal in the corners of a box, and nothing else was there. The poor old lady had starved to death. She perished before the doctor arrived. The sadness of the whole thing. I had been down there as a child, sent many times with a bit of tea and some little things, and I loved the dear old soul. When my mother came home and told us what had happened, I began to cry. A few days later, her funeral was held at Moose Hill Church. She was placed in a wooden box and for a casket, and a simple ceremony was held, and several who would not have spoken to her during her lifetime and ostracized her completely were there at the last. At the close of the ceremony, her sister went to the casket and, placing her hand upon it and her other hand high in the air, she said, "At last she has paid for her sin."
There's a grim horse purse, and the horse has no springs, and hark to the dirge the sad driver sings. Rattle her bones over the stones, she is only a pauper whom nobody owns.
And no one really knows for sure where she was buried. The story has always been that she was buried outside of her own home there in one of the fields in an unmarked grave. There was a story that there was a bad person got buried across the street from the Moose Hill Church, and they wanted her walled off from the sacred ground. So they built the wall between her grave, and if this is true, her grave is probably just about under where the road is now. But no one knows for sure.
Like sands through the hourglass, so are the days of our lives.
I still say them shows are taken right from life. I can almost read what's going to happen on it by things that's happened right in my life.
This is MacDonald Carey, and these are the days of our lives.
All my life has been one thing that has stood out in my mind. It is a true story. That's the pity of it. It's a true story.
It's true that Emmeline Gurney was shunned by the town for something, but whether she actually married her own son, as Nettie said, or whether people in town only believed she did, or whether Emmeline was shunned simply because she was poor or stupid, we may never know.
Someone has put flowers on my grave, though I'm not there. But this is the spot.
2 days before her 95th birthday, Nettie Mitchell passed away. The story she told of Emmeline Gurney lives on, and because of it, Emmeline today is more a part of her hometown than when she was alive.